A resolution voted by the U.S. House of Representatives declaring war on the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland was ratified by the U.S. Senate on June 17, 1812. On June 18, President James Madison officially signed the resolution into law. The nation's sentiments for Great Britain were not all the same. The war was opposed by many members of the Federalist political party, which was made up of business people and bankers. Members of the Democratic-Republican Party, who were numerically dominant over the Federalists, thought that a conflict was warranted. The United States' ports were placed under blockade by the British government following the declaration of war. When ships were dispatched to shut down the ports of New York and others farther south, such as those on the Chesapeake Bay, they started enforcing the blockade more strictly in 1813. Hampton Roads near the opening of Chesapeake Harbor were seized by British ships commanded by Rear Admiral George Cockburn in early February 1813, halting trade entering and leaving the harbor. Major ports like the Port of Baltimore in Maryland and Norfolk in Virginia were essentially shut down as a result. Cockburn began raiding villages along the Chesapeake in the spring. Crops and cattle were among the items destroyed or taken during the invasions. The majority of Havre de Grace, Maryland was burned by Cockburn on May 3rd. On May 6th, Georgetown and Fredericktown, two more coastal communities in Maryland, were destroyed by fire. Cockburn referred to First Lady Dolly Madison's raids as savage and threatened to kidnap and display her about London. Cockburn made it a rule that he would leave a town uninjured if it had no militia or firearms. Cockburn's direct superior, Vice Admiral Sir John Borlase Warren, had his headquarters at Bermuda. According to Warren, he lacked the ships necessary to blockade the American shore. He got more ships and 2 battalions of Marines in May. A formal blockade of New York and the Mississippi River was declared by him on May 26th. The Charleston, Port Royal, and Savannah ports in South Carolina were also described as blockaded in the same proclamation. Because of the Chesapeake Bay's naval depots, ships, dockyards, and foundries, Royal Marines were deployed there. The immediate targets included Washington, D.C., Baltimore, and Norfolk. During the summer of 1812, Admiral Sir John Borlase Warren commanded North America and the West Indies. Rear Admiral George Cockburn reported to Warren aboard HMS Marlborough in January 1813. Cockburn had 8 ships and 45 barges, comprising an Army regiment and 2 Royal Marine battalions, for the St. Michaels raid. Lieutenant James Polkinghorne of the Royal Navy commanded the soldiers that landed. He submitted a report to Royal Navy Commander Henry Lorraine Baker following the combat. Baker oversaw HMS Conflict, a sloop equipped with 10 to 12 guns, sometimes known as artillery pieces or cannons. To get to the coast, the men utilized barges which were driven by modest sails and oars. The carronade was a light cannon carried by the barges. In 1813, there weren't many federal troops in the area of St. Michaels. The state militia was often in charge of fighting. 12 brigades and 11 cavalry districts made up the 3 divisions into which Maryland's militia was divided. Following the British HMS Leopard's raid on the USS Chesapeake in 07, a large portion of the Talbot County militia was established. The militias of Caroline, Dorchester, and Talbot counties were headed by American Revolutionary War veteran Brigadier General Perry Benson. 3 artillery batteries, 2 regiments, and several cavalry companies made up his army at the fight. Despite his size, Benson's brigade was lacking in training. It was also lacking in weapons. Companies that were close to threatening positions employed muskets, which were then moved to the next threat as the first one passed. Benson had a sizable force at St. Michaels, but the artillerists were in charge of the battle. In early August 1813, Kent Island in Maryland was taken by the British. The island sits across the harbor from Annapolis, the state capital of Maryland, and north of St. Michaels. Since most of the population left when they heard about the invasion, the British encountered little opposition when they landed around 3,000 soldiers on the island. The island had food and fresh water, and would provide a base for attacks against Maryland's eastern shore, Annapolis, Baltimore, and Washington.
Talbot County was alarmed by the British presence in Eastern Bay between Kent Island and St. Michaels during this period. St. Michaels had at least 6 ships under construction, making it a target due to its shipbuilding. Additionally, it served as an outport for Easton, the biggest town on Maryland's eastern shore. Easton boasted a bank, the lone arsenal on the eastern shore of Maryland, and a plenty of commodities for the British to loot. On the St. Michaels River, boats and other small boats could reach Easton within 3 miles, 4.8 kilometers. Fort Stokes, a 6-gun post, guarded Treadhaven Creek, a second water route to Easton. In order to support the local infantry company, St. Michaels Patriotic Blues, led by Captain Joseph Kemp, and the artillery troops under Lieutenant William Dodson, militiamen from all around Talbot County were dispatched to St. Michaels. At least 3 of the Eastern companies wore uniforms, as did Kemp's group. About 500 soldiers made up the militia forces, which were commanded by Colonel Thomas Jones, Colonel Auld, and Brigadier General Benson. The 2 churches in the town served as quarters for the men. 3 gun batteries were positioned throughout the town. Dodson led a company of 30 soldiers with a battery of 4 cannons behind a small fortress east of town. It was near the mouth of the town's port on the south side, and it was called Parrot's Point, or just Parrot Point. To keep ships out of the port, a boom was erected across its mouth. John Graham commanded a 2-gun battery on wheels near Dawson's Wharf at the end of Mulberry Street in the town, while Wrightson Jones and John Thompson manned the 6-pounder cannons. In case the British landed behind the town and marched toward it, 2 more cannons were positioned outside the town. Lieutenant Clement Vickers commanded this 2-gun battery, which was manned by Easton soldiers from the Talbot Volunteer Artillerists Unit. To keep an eye on the British at Kent Island, vedettes were posted at several locations and reported to Brigadier General Benson in Easton or Colonel Auld in St. Michaels. North of the town, close to Deepwater Point on the St. Michaels River, a British brig was spotted conducting reconnaissance. At Bayside, a deserter landed after crossing the Eastern Bay. He claimed that the British intended to assault St. Michaels within the week, but they were concerned about what they believed to be a battery of 10 guns. 9 to 18 barges carrying 300 British soldiers and Marines sailed up the St. Michaels River early on August 10th. They proceeded down the beach opposite St. Michaels in the darkened fog, and the river was more than a mile wide, 1.6 kilometers. The British Army passed the port and proceeded up the river without being seen by the videographers on the St. Michaels side. In hazy darkness, the force crossed the river and came close to Parrot's Point at about 4 a.m. John Stevens, an African-American, found them as they disembarked in water close to the Dodson's cannons and breastworks. Most of Dodson's shocked soldiers dropped their guns and ran back to town through a cornfield in a panic. Only the grain was harmed by the British musket discharge at the escaping troops. Dodson, Stevens, and a 3rd man were the only individuals still holding the firearms. 1 cannon, loaded with canister and ball, was successfully repositioned by the 3 guys such that it could fire on the British. The British anticipated capturing the battery without encountering any opposition after witnessing Dodson's men flee, but instead they were confronted with the contents of a 9-pounder gun. Dodson and his 2 men retreated, but they persisted in the guns despite their losses. The weapons were taken and rendered inoperable. The British brought their dead and injured back to the barges, marking the end of a crucial portion of their operation. The barges were unable to pass the previously positioned boom, even though they had advanced to less than half a mile from town. They used 2 cannons to fire at the town before moving into a position farther out in the river and shooting with much vigor thereafter. A St. Michael's tale says that the town confused the British and caused them to overshoot their objectives by hanging lanterns in trees far from the buildings. At Dawson's Wharf, Graham's battery fired back, eventually firing 10 bullets in all. As the British started to withdraw, the Easton artillerists heard the cannon fire and relocated their artillery from the Bayside Road to Mill Point in town. They fired 5 shots in all. The artillery battle ended around 9 a.m. when Benson was waiting in the town center with his cavalry and troops. Despite outnumbering the British army, they avoided conflict. The town avoided the same fate as Havre de Grace because it had been effectively resisted. According to Lieutenant Polkinghorne's report, only 2 wounded were lost by his British ground force. According to Benson's report, some of the houses were perforated, but there was no injury to any human being in relation to the American casualties. By referring to much blood on the grass at the water where the British barges were, he also suggested that the British had suffered losses. 1 captain, 1 lieutenant of the Marines, and 27 privates were among the casualties, according to a Royal Navy deserter. He also believed there was serious damage to one of the barges. One of the British fatalities, according to a 2nd deserter, was an officer. On August 26th, St. Michaels was once more threatened by the British. They deployed 60 barges with 2,100 troops this time. 500 Talbot County militia members, comprising infantry, cavalry, and artillery, greeted 1,800 soldiers as they landed around 6 miles, 9.7 kilometers, north of town. The British retreated, and the war's biggest combat on the Maryland eastern shore was reduced to a few volleys. Warren stated that he experienced issues with Army desertions and the Marines' lack of discipline. On August 22nd, his forces decided that attacks on Annapolis and Baltimore would be foolish, since both American cities had acquired significant reinforcements and they started to prepare to sail away from Kent Island. Before hurricane season began, he also wanted to cruise to Halifax, Canada. By September, Cockburn had left for Bermuda and Warren had left for Halifax. For blockade operations, a tiny skeleton force was positioned at the Virginia Capes.